welcome back to Call Time with Katie Birnbaum. I hope you guys enjoyed the special episode 2 weeks ago. The response has been really amazing. And so it seems like every few episodes, I'll return to that format. So let me know in the comments if there's a particular show you want me to unpack next. But I'm really excited to be getting back to the regular form with strong, cerebral, in-depth interviews with theater's best and brightest artists, especially because I've long admired this guest from afar for his work on stage and off. We're going to get into so much today, and I feel like the timing worked out really well. Like, it feels very topical right now, and that was just coincidence. So without further ado, the fantastic Ryan Vasquez. Welcome, Ryan.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for being here. Should I do a little pandemic vibe check with you? We did a bit of that before I started recording, but what's your mental state right now?
I'm doing all right. I mean, it feels as if the temperature is increasing a little, right? Like the social temperature, the literal temperature, of course, but this sort of we're in many ways have made this progress through this increasingly difficult time, and then in many ways we're finding ourselves sort of emerging into a summer that is terrifyingly similar to the one last year. And so I think we're looking toward a hopeful future, but it's conditional. And I think that the emphasis on the conditions is what's going to really like tell the rest of the story. So yeah, I'm feeling hopeful and energized and all of those things, and heavy, but I don't think that's all that bad. So
yeah, I think you're feeling how many people, particularly in our community and our industry, are feeling. So we're going to get into all of that. But for viewers who may not know Ryan, I'm going to give a little intro so you don't have to do your own. Ryan was born, but you can always correct me on anything because I have gotten things wrong in the past. It's just me. There's no fact checker. Ryan was born in California and educated at the University of Michigan before moving to New York to work as an actor. He made his Broadway debut shortly thereafter in Wicked before appearing in the original Broadway cast of Waitress and both the national tour and the Broadway company of Hamilton. Recently, he appeared as the Man in Black in the musical The Wrong Man, for which he was nominated for a Drama Desk. And in addition to all of this noteworthy acting career, which he managed to jam-pack in a short time out of college, he's also the founder of Swing From Home, a political advocacy organization dedicated to helping and funding progressive down-ballot candidates, which is a cause very close to my heart. And one of the big reasons why I wanted to have him on the show, because I see him definitely as one of the models of how you can be both an actor and an activist. Ryan, anything to add?
Oh, I will need to clip that and add it to that was perfect, especially like the bits about Swing From Home. Like, that is, you wouldn't believe like how long it took me to get the exact language in there for like exactly what we would call it, and that was like better. So thank you.
Well, I do have experience with it because I'm involved with a political advocacy organization called Blue Neighbors Project, which focuses specifically on Georgia, which this election, obviously,
Congratulations.
We were like, whoa, yeah. Thank you. But so when I was looking at your bio on your website, I was like, this language is very similar to our language. So I'm just going to lift it on up from there. Well, great. So I figured we'd start out swinging, and then we can get into some like more fun, like fluffier stuff later. But we've been living through this time of major upheaval, both in the world, but specifically in our industry. We've all been out of work for over a year, no health insurance. Scott Rudin stepped down from his producing role, though I'm sure we can get into what that actually means practically after this article came out about his abusive workplace behavior in The Hollywood Reporter. Karen Olivo announced she would step down from Moulin Rouge out of protest. There have been all these necessary conversations about equity that were sparked after the murder of George Floyd this summer. I've had some of those conversations on my show. And I know we discussed earlier at the Broadway for Racial Justice March yesterday. So with all of that being said, I definitely think of you and think of your decision or your announcement to leave Hamilton as being one of the catalysts for many of these discussions that people in our community are having. So, and I definitely think that's pretty brave. So can you walk me through some of your thinking about that decision?
Sure. Um, so I had been involved in Hamilton for many years. I started on the national tour in 2017. It's a show that has had an impact that has been litigated and relitigated as we look at it with new eyes. It is an incredibly complex piece to have a majority cast of actors of color portraying slave owners, portraying the founding fathers, telling this story that is in many ways as sort of analog for a lot of the things that we're talking about now. It's incredibly sort of it is deep. The ripple of these topics and this show particularly are widespread now, right? And so throughout throughout my time there as a white actor in the company, the sort of MO of Hamilton has always been that the casting is America now telling the story of America then, right? And America now is intersectional. And so it's not that it is wrong to have white people telling stories in Hamilton, but I had sort of a unique space there in that I was playing the principal roles. I think like a lot of white actors have been in the ensemble, have swung the show, have played a role or two, but I was playing roles like Hamilton, Burr, George Washington, and in that, I think there was always a sort of cognitive dissonance there. There was always a disparate sort of attitude that I had in occupying that space. I had it sort of justified and challenged to me, and I had discussions about this with people in the company, with my friends outside of the company. I mean, this was like a consistent sort of just conversation that was happening with people advocating on both sides about space being occupied there, and then I think, like many people, the murder of George Floyd impacted me, my space in the industry and in the world. And I very early on was then sort of thinking that it would not be that the space I was occupying in Hamilton was potentially harmful for the people who felt like it should be safe for them. That whiteness asserting itself in a space that is sacred for people of color is often harmful just by its presence alone. And so then there were a lot of stories that were being shared about all sorts of shows, Hamilton included, about white supremacy's effect on the actors in that show, effect on people of color in that show. And one of which that was very powerful and that struck me was written by Dan Belnavis, who is actually a friend of mine from college. We attended the University of Michigan together, and then we happened to be on this tour together. And as I read it and as I remembered certain things that I felt like were innocuous at the time that were having an impact on people, it solidified for me that this was a decision that I had to make. And so I reached out to Dan, and he and I spoke briefly. I didn't want to insert myself into his sharing of this story, obviously, for the same reasons that I've talked about. And shortly after, we connected again, and we discussed how it potentially would feel and appear that I was trying to offload some of that guilt onto him personally without sharing something publicly about this decision, about my relationship with the show, about my continued involvement. And so I wrote up a little thing. I shared it with him. I shared it with some of my friends to see people who had been in the show, people who had not, just to sort of gauge if this was worth sharing, if this was something that was important, and ultimately decided that it was. And so this is a decision that I am making. This is not a decision that I am imposing on anybody else, but this is something that I think when we're reimagining what the workplace will look like, when we're thinking about what it means to return to work safely, the only conversations that we've had have been about COVID, it's been, will people be vaccinated? Will people be wearing masks in the theater? But are we returning to work safely if everyone in the theater is masked and sitting one seat apart, but people are experiencing racism daily and there's no meaningful accountability structure? No. You know, are we returning safely to work if everyone on stage is vaccinated, but people are being misgendered consistently backstage and they're not reflected in leadership, and so there's no one to go to discuss it? No. You know, and frankly, are we returning to work safely if you're going back to a contract off-Broadway that pays less than the rate of unemployment? I mean, there's many things that we need to be discussing when it comes to this safe return. And so that I felt like, am I contributing to a safe work environment by inserting myself back into these roles as a white person, as a cisgendered white man, which is the most oppressive identity that we have? And no, I'm not. You know, it's contributing to harms that people have articulated already publicly and shared. And so, you know, I was involved in a few things prior to the pandemic, shows that were sort of like baking and figuring out their path. You know, all of those things, of course, are derailed. And regardless of the show, I think we all need to be thinking about how we return safely, what the environment is to return safely, because to me, regardless of whether you're returning to one show or another, your space in a show that is, you know, predominantly people of color, predominantly white people, it doesn't matter. How are we returning, and should we return unless these structures are in place? And it is my opinion that regardless, Hamilton, anything else, we cannot return to work. We cannot return to a space that is unsafe after these things have been articulated bravely and boldly and loudly by these people. So that's, I guess, the stump speech about it. I haven't really spoken publicly other than something that I had the time to write and sort of share. So that's sort of the word vomit version. But yeah, that's where my head was at and where it's at now.
Absolutely not word vomit. Very articulate, as I thought your written statement that you put on social media was as well. So thank you for sharing that with us on this platform. You know, I have so many questions based on that, and you sort of summed it up in some ways perfectly, but I think it's really interesting how you have been able to connect your particular experience with Hamilton with this larger question of should we all go back to work, and with the larger movement of Broadway for racial justice. So do you see that relationship between your decision and the demands that the Broadway for Racial Justice movement and march was making?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right. That's I think where I hope that when people are reading these things or reading these individual acts of I mean, stepping aside sounds sort of whatever now because of that was a language that Scott Rudin used, right, which I'm sure we'll get into, but you know, when people see these acts of solidarity, right, at the march, the Rebecca, whose last name I'm forgetting, but who is running for city council in New York, who was saying that, you know, solidarity is an act and not it's a verb and not a noun, right? These acts of solidarity, when people see these individual acts, because one thing I do want to say is it is clear that no organization is going to take the onus upon themselves to instill these things. The Broadway League is not going to do this. The Actors Equity is likely not going to do it either. I think that the space to do it is in the union. And if there has not been meaningful work done in the past year, I do not see the hope for it. I'm hopeful that the march will get the ball rolling in that direction, but I am not hopeful that there is going to be this transformation of our industry on behalf of people of color by equity. So by big E equity, right? Actors Equity. Yeah. And so I'm hoping that people see individual acts and see how it connects to the idea of making space, to the idea of making a safe work environment. And again, not just in shows like Hamilton, not just in shows that sort of are so in the public eye and have been discussed, but just in your daily life. One thing that I'm trying to do for myself so much so much of our issues in public engagement is that our public engagement comes as a reaction to something, obviously, or it comes as, in anticipation of something, but just right before an election, right? People descend on Georgia in between the election of Joe Biden and the runoff. People want to physically go down there. People are like, I'll go to Georgia, I'll do whatever. It's too late. The infrastructure needs to be there. And when the liberal elite come in and say, oh, we can help, we can do this, that's not a legitimate exercise. And so to me, I think we need to be thinking about incorporating these things into daily life. When you see a candidate or a cause that you are passionate about or that strikes you, do that work right then. Go and sign that petition right then, or donate $5 right then. You don't need to, in October of an election year, donate $500 to candidates that you like. We should be doing this in rolling amounts throughout our lives. Every day needs to have civic engagement, right? And so we saw this, now we're talking about equity and actors equity, and the last equity election, 20% of members voted, which is abysmal. And we were all trying to mobilize in like the days leading up to the election. And people are looking at the literature about the candidates and saying, I can't figure out what this person stands for. I can't figure out and of course you can't. We're trying to cram for the final when we should have been studying all year. And so that idea, I think, I'm hoping that this, whether it's somebody stepping aside from a show, whether it's somebody demanding meaningful anti-racist training in order to return to work, whether it's demanding, whatever it is that we can individually have conversations with agents, our representatives, our producers that are working on our stuff, creative teams. I hope that just instills this idea that we are consistently chipping away rather than burning out in anticipation of a moment like reopening of an industry or an election or what have you. So that's, to me, how it connects. It's like, if that just inspires you to go do something that's small for yourself or by yourself for others, rather, that to me is productive, and it doesn't have to be in conjunction with some large movement. It should be consistent.
Yeah. And I actually think, I know you made the point that it doesn't have to be, of course, a show as on a scale like Hamilton or even Broadway necessarily, because I think regional theaters and off-Broadway theaters have just as much, if not more, work to do in that regard. But I think it's very powerful that it was a show like Hamilton that you stepped down from. Again, I'm going to use that phrase because I'm sure there's a group of people who on the surface would say like, oh, Hamilton is this good show? Is this nominally a force of good in the world? And therefore, wouldn't any good actor being good in the show be good and progressive? Not to use that word a million times. And I'm curious, what was the point at which you decided, like, my presence here, even though this show, I still think Hamilton is a force of good, but even though this show is good and progressive, my presence here is not those things?
Yeah, I like I said, I had other things sort of brewing as we were heading into the shutdown. And so my initial plan was to leave Hamilton regardless. And then of course, everything changes with the pandemic. Now, all of a sudden, nothing is certain. There are shows like Hamilton, Wicked, these long-standing shows that are going to come back with consistency, with salaries that are going to be higher than what it would be to develop a show out of town or develop a show in New York, off-Broadway, anything like that. So then everybody sort of ran back to their corner, right? It was like, okay, if I have a space here, then I can hold on to it, because that's what we do when we're afraid. We say, okay, we'll come back here. And right, exactly. So you sort of burrow in and say, okay, well then when this comes back, I'll be able to be safe here. And as these stories started to be shared, I think actually, regardless of sort of the theater angle of this, our industry's angle of this, I've been trying to make sense of this. And I think, as a white person, in my experience, it has been easier to distance and dissociate yourself from white violence, from white harm on people when you feel like you're not directly perpetrating it. It feels like when we see stories in the news, obviously, I mean, police brutality coming to mind most viscerally, you can say, wow, that is terrible, but I am not a police officer. So I can lend my voice, I can lend resources to this, but I know that as far as feeling like I'm complicit in that system, it is easier, I think, to dissociate and eliminate that white discomfort when you feel like you are not directly perpetrating this violence. But now we're having these conversations about this violence in our own industry, and many people are falling silent. And that's because they're realizing, oh, this is actually something that I am perpetrating, right? And so that's where I think when we're talking about, you know, how many of us have learned in the abstract this year, oh, there are some spaces that should just be reserved for this group. Do not impose yourself in this space. And if Hamilton is not a space like that, I mean, in our industry, then I do not know what is. And so I think, you know, it's a decision for everyone to make, but I find it frustrating that there's a lot of these decisions being made in the abstract by people, but that when it is in our backyard, when it is viscerally in our world, people are able to turn an eye because it feels too uncomfortable now, because my impact on this issue, my impact on white supremacy can't be that bad, right? Like that's sort of what we can tell ourselves until it's in our face in our own community. And so, you know, it's not just people who have shared stories about Hamilton, it's all of these conversations, all of this anti-racist learning and training that is now coming to a focus in our world, in our community, on Broadway, in the theater industry more widely. And so how do we confront that when we are made explicitly complicit in that, right? So yeah, so I mean, I think it's just that sort of like mental hurdle of like of deciding to, of looking at yourself and saying, you know, how are we complicit in the abstract? How are we complicit in things like capitalism and in these large systems where you feel like an ant in an anthill? But then how are you complicit in a way where you are bigger than an ant? Like that is I think the tougher part that we're all really wrestling with. And so that's sort of I think that's where like the connectors sort of met. And, you know, so now that we're returning and we're talking about returning to different projects and different things. And some of these shows that I was involved in prior, without like naming too many details that I don't think I can name, but they're sort of getting like the gears are like just now brushing the rust off, and we're saying like, hey, we're thinking about, you know, like we don't know what it'll look like, we have no idea, but you know, we want to get back into development and all of these things. And I've had to stop myself from that initial feeling of, oh great, oh thank God, I can finally go and say, okay, but how are we going to approach this? So saying, yes, thank you for reaching out. I'm brainstorming now about what things I will bring to producers, to offers, and say, I will not work unless this is happening, you know. And if you lose jobs because of that, that's really unfortunate. And I have faith that that is a way that we can make some tangible change, like company by company, individual by individual, because again, I don't know if there will be a broad effort by any of these organizations to implement these things.
I'm wondering if the onus is on us, which as you're saying, and I agree, I think it is, what kinds of questions and demands, for lack of a better word, do you think people need to be bringing to the table? And what do you think an actor's role in that is?
Yeah. That's the tricky part, right? That's the part,
right.
That's the tricky part about this march and the union's involvement, is that for like listeners who have not read, if you are a white listener who has not read The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, that is a book that came out earlier this year that's about how racism affects everybody, and how, you know, how we're so focused on this sort of zero-sum myth that there's not enough opportunity, there's not enough for everybody, that your progress will come at an expense to mine, that your gain will come at a cost to me, that we fight amongst ourselves while people at the top, you know, sort of eat well, right? And so in that sort of vein, in that book, there's a whole chapter about unions, and the Knights of Labor is the first labor union in America. They let in everybody except for bankers and lawyers, right? Of course. And their motto was an injury to one is the concern of all, right? If we cannot stand in solidarity, that is the point of the union. If we cannot stand in solidarity all together, it makes these conversations and these points much more difficult, because then it becomes your personal judgment as far as what you personally think you need. And that's why we need to be reaching out to these organizations that already exist, things like Broadway for Racial Justice, and say, what is it that you, as a person who has been marginalized by white supremacy in this industry, as a group of people who have brainstormed about these ideas, what is it that you see as a path forward that I can then demand and exercise my privilege to command, and so, or to demand rather. So I think as far as just broadly, we're having these conversations all the time. I am sort of in conversation with some of these organizations to see what it is, and listening to these organizations. And for instance, Broadway for Racial Justice has a program called Allied with BFRJ that allows for a third-party accountability system that would be Broadway for Racial Justice, and they partner with universities, with casting offices, and will with productions to say, we are a third-party organization that provides not only just like a hotline for you to call if something happens, but we are consistently coming in and demanding accountability for the things that you have said that you will implement. And so, meaningful anti-racism training, not the waiver that we sign that says we won't harass anybody when we start work. This meaningful anti-racism training that is continued, an accountability structure, compensation for creative work. Too often we go in and do pre-production for shows, and we do it for free, and you see people of color in those rooms, and you see people who then do not continue with the show, and they've developed choreography that then is used on Broadway and in commercials, and they never see a penny. Those to me are sort of the three tenets that I'm looking into now. But you talked about Karen earlier, Karen Olivo, she and Eden Espinosa have this organization, Affect Change, that's working on an inclusion contractual rider, something that as an actor you can bring and say, these are the things. And again, exactly like what you said, regional theaters, off-Broadway theaters, Broadway theaters, these are all different universes as far as what they can do, what is feasible, and so we need to be flexible in really actually meaningfully working with these organizations and saying, okay, how can we do meaningful work here to make meaningful change with what you are equipped to do, and push you and challenge you, but also, you won't be able to go into summer stock theaters in rural wherever and ask for a lot of the things that you can ask for in the company of Hamilton. You just can't. The resources aren't there. So we need to, I think that's all comes back to the onus individually on the actor. But that meaningful anti-racism training and a third-party accountability structure. It can't be from the union. It can't be from the cast. There's no deputy. There's no, there's no person that can be internally. There has to be somebody who comes in and who evaluates consistently what is going on and makes sure that the workplace is safe. And so that's something that I'm in talks, at least with a couple of these production offices and things, to figure out, what it is that we can do.
It's so hard too, because I feel like so many of these, obviously all of these conversations right now are basically completely theoretical because no one is working. So right. It can be very easy for a company or whoever to be like, yes, we're going to do this. Yes, sure, anything you want. But the proof will be in the pudding when we actually are back in a rehearsal room. That reminds me too, you've been talking a lot about civic engagement and what our duty is as an actor. And I'm curious because there's certainly a group of people less vocal now, but certainly they still exist, who believe that an actor's job is just to come in, do the thing and be good and then leave. And I'm curious what you would say to those people, and whether you think being an activist or being politically involved is symbiotic with being an artist.
Exactly. Yes. So especially when you're talking about, oh, all these conversations are hypothetical, right? And we're talking about how civic engagement needs to be consistent. And to me, if civic engagement is consistent, and if we are talking about these things in a consistent and sort of constant way and marrying it with every action and everything that we do, white supremacy is a strong current in the river, right? And it is eventually opening up into a large pool of people who are just stuck in this pool. And the pool contains all people, all different types of people who have just been swept either by this current, or as a white person by this ideology, and are comfortable with it and just go into this large pool. And it takes a consistent swimming upstream to dismantle these things. And you can't take 6 months off of that process and expect to come out again and be in the same place in the river, because everything we do is baked into this. So it doesn't, I mean, that's difficult for a lot of people to hear, because it's like, oh, that's exhausting. Like, I won't be able to swim upstream for the rest of my life. But it's like, you're thinking of your exhaustion as how exhausted you felt in the 2 weeks where you were phone banking every other day in Georgia, right? But that's not consistent. That is burning yourself out for one event. And so if we're continuing to spread our sort of internal resources throughout, right, like then it's not these heavy conversations of like, how do we repair our industry, how do we burn down and rebuild this industry. It's like the idea of burning it down is only being spoken about because there is such a large structure that is in place that doesn't feel like you can chip away at it. Whereas if we're chipping away every day, every action, every micro thing, then we're not needing to go in and have these large concentrated pushes and efforts. We're only needing to do these things because the current is so strong, because not enough people are swimming upstream. So again, it's solidarity. It's this power in numbers. It's this idea of course it's symbiotic. It's symbiotic to being an artist, but to being a person is continuing to to use your resources to better the world. Like, that's what it's about. Like, you can't take it with you, right? It doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't matter, it's like we're talking about these long-standing structures that need to be chipped away, and that is an effective way to do it. And so to me, it's symbiotic with being an artist, because we're sharing stories about vulnerability. We're asking people to be vulnerable. I mean, if you're an artist who's showing up, who's just clocking in and like tap dancing and leaving, like I don't really know like why you're doing this. Like I really don't. Some people actually really are like content to just smile and dance and leave. Every single thing I have done has included people like that. And I envy them in a way, because I'm like, wow, that is like my neuroses could never, right? And so, but now, but if you really dig in, it's like, why did we get into this? Like, why are you really only doing this because you were put in dance as a kid and now you're just continuing to dance and you're sort of lost in this career? That's okay, that makes sense. But I think many of us joined this community because we were attracted to it, because we were able to be vulnerable. We felt like we belonged. There was something greater. And so if that doesn't translate to you for how you engage in the world, if there is not something greater in that way too, I am, and that's where like I oscillate between being frustrated and just truly being confused. I'm just, honestly, there are so many white actors who, and I had this conversation, and this is a heavy thing to hear, but like the black square thing that everybody is referencing, right? If you posted your black square, that's not enough. Well, if you posted a picture of George Floyd on the day of the verdict, that's also not enough. That literally means nothing. That is not, and it doesn't mean that you can't do it in addition to other things. Of course you should show solidarity. I'm not saying that it's cheap, but even if you clock every injustice in the world and share a meme about it as it comes, you have done nothing actionable. You've done nothing. And so one day of applying yourself in phone banking, one email to a producer saying, I will not work unless we have meaningful anti-racism training. That ripples miles beyond sharing something on the internet with nothing actionable attached. And so that to me, it is honestly just confusing how people have now realized, okay, now, I mean, I guess it's not confusing. People have now realized, okay, if I at least share everything, if I'm at least showing solidarity, I don't have to act in it. And you're wrong. You're wrong. And then I'm gonna stop. But now that is coming to a head. Now the conversation between acting in solidarity and showing solidarity and the differences between them are coming to a head, because now we're having difficult conversations about returning to work, difficult conversations about personal sacrifice, difficult conversations about making space. And there were people, when I posted that about Hamilton, who reached out, and white people from Hamilton who reached out and said, this is disingenuous. I need to find a way to poke a hole in this, because if I allow it to hold water, if I allow this to be truthful, then I have to examine something about my own personal sacrifice, and that I will not do. But what I will do is post a million photos and post a million tweets that are quippy from AOC. And so now that those things are overlapping, that is why I think we're marching. That is why these conversations are becoming more meaningful. And that is why I think the temperature is rising, because it's becoming real.
Yeah, it gets back to like the essential lie of social media, because in every way we confuse social media for our lives. Oh, if I show pictures of me and my friends, it means that I'm popular or whatever.
It means that I'm friends with these people.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. People thinking that the surface is all that matters. And I agree with you that I think that's really dangerous, especially in these really important conversations. And also with what you said about, people who just clock in and do the work and clock out. I think part of it too is connected to the way we are trained, because I think correct me if I'm wrong, I think things are changing now in that it is more acceptable to be an artist who has a strong opinion about things and is politically motivated and civically engaged. But I sort of think minding our own business and just doing the work was in many respects baked into the industry and the expectations of the industry. It reminds me a bit of, did you read the Tavi Gevinson article that came out this morning about Scott Rudin?
No. Oh, no, but I did see it. Yeah, no, I haven't.
It's really great. I recommend reading it. But she basically talks about how the attitude that is either, well, he liked me, so I'm just going to keep doing my work, or, well, he was an equal opportunity abuser. Like it was something everyone had to go through, like a rite of passage, allows the behavior to continue. And I think that culture in our industry of like, you have to shut up or else you're never going to get hired again is what allows people to think that I can't be an activist, I can't be politically involved, and I can't also be an artist.
Yes. And that is baked into the fact that the standard of what it means to speak out. I mean, talk about the difference between action and like posting on social media, right? The march is exactly where that met. Now you can go and show solidarity by posting things about a march, by being there, by showing your solidarity, but you have to act, you have to be there. You have to literally physically go and do it. And that is where so many people tapped out. That is where it became, oh, okay, well, if this isn't all, if I can't completely control this narrative for myself, and the fear of speaking out about inequality, that fear comes from the structure of what you can talk about, exactly what you're talking about, Rudin. It's like, well, he liked me. The people who made the sort of rule, the structure of what you can and cannot talk about, what you are allowed to say, and what will, quote unquote, get you in trouble or get that person who's chomping at the bit, waiting in the wings for you to take your job. Those rules, those things, look at the top of our industry, of every industry, look at the top of ours. It is cis white men, and many of whom are like Scott Rudin, are abusive in this way. And tyrannical, frankly. So how do you expect people to feel? How do you expect that people will act if they've been told, oh, the gradient on which you fall of social acceptability, when it's controlled by the people who are acting in the way that Scott Rudin is acting, then of course staying quiet and not saying anything is your best move. Of course that, you know, in your sort of zero-sum myth, survival of the fittest. And that's what gets tough is, I think in our industry specifically, in the Broadway community, the zero-sum myth is actually a reality. There are not enough spots. But why are there not good paying, fulfilling, legitimate theater jobs all across the country? Why are people working in the heartland for $200 a week on a show and having to book themselves 52 weeks a year and doing these things? You know, I've worked at summer stock theaters. I've worked at small theaters that are in black box theaters. It's like these places are scraping by. The amount of free things that I have done this year just to lend my voice to these places. And I always do it happily because I understand how it works. But like, why is that happening? And it's because, again, like Scott Rudin, even after stepping aside, he's going to take his salary. He's going to take his investments. Like these people, just like everything, it just makes me laugh. Like the people who, because you can't help but just be hysterical about it. Like the people who are like Bernie bros in our industry who don't show up to the march. What are you doing? The cognitive dissonance is insane. The Scott Rudin thing, Karen said this in her video, but we actually spoke about it prior to her posting that. And like the Scott Rudin speaking about it, and I'm not talking about the abusers or the abused rather, who are coming forward. That is a different thing. The people who are just standing and saying that abuse, that abuser, that is wrong. That is not difficult to do in this environment. That is in fact embraced. To stand up and say, people are worried that they're going to lose their jobs and lose their reputation. There's no jobs to go back to. No jobs exist. And your reputation, what does it say about your reputation to stand up and say that somebody smashing a computer on somebody's hand and running into their room and calling their lawyer is wrong? What does it say about that? And it's not just people who are in his shows. It's exactly what you're saying. It's the condition of fear that if I do this, there will be somebody else who won't do it, who will just lay low and be quiet, you know? Yeah. But again, did we get into this industry to lay low and be quiet? Many may have, but I can't imagine that under some truth serum, people think about their first experience on stage and think, I was just so happy to blend in.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And obviously all of these issues interconnect. And I think a huge part of it, as you say, is about the unequal financial structure of our industry. You mentioned your first experience on stage, so I'm going to make something of a right turn into some fun stuff.
Of course, yes.
So I'm sure we will return to this, but I could talk about it for much longer. I'm curious, what was there a moment when you were young, when you were like, this is it, this is for me, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life?
Yeah, I grew up in San Jose, California, and it happens to be the home of the largest children's theater in the country, Children's Musical Theater of San Jose. And they cast everybody who auditions. So you had people who were, you had casts of like 100, and all on stage, all crammed on stage and trying to, stage everybody into these numbers. What that does, I think, is it invites people to walk into these doors and just find community. There were people who, I remember there were kids that were, the director's literally like, do you have your phone in your hand on stage? Like, it's just like stop, yeah. It's like, but they're just there to find community. They're there they've made friends. And so they're there. And in the green room there, it looked like a high school cafeteria. Like, it's like the groups and everything and the people who are bonding over different things. And 75% of those people probably didn't care at all about theater or about whatever. Like they were there because they loved to participate in this way, but they were honestly like shy. They actually did want to blend in. They didn't want to be like out in front and doing it. It actually was not appealing to them. And then you had in those groups, you have then of course this small kind of concentrated group that's like, no, we're kind of taking this seriously. And so I definitely came in. I mean, my first show I ever did, I was 8 years old. It was Schoolhouse Rock Live, as in like, I'm just a Bill, right? And like literally, like that was literally a song in it. And I remember thinking like, I'm just here for community. Like I don't know what this is. Like I was the typical story, like a hyperactive kid, but I didn't think that I was playing sports. I was doing like the whole finding myself.
Did you have
And
siblings or anything who were in it, or was it just like,
no,
no?
no. Yeah, no. It was just in that kind of like, I think, frankly, like young white potpourri of getting finding yourself in any activity that you felt like you belonged in, and so I grew up with my mom raised me like basically by herself, and she became super involved in the theater and like in this children's theater, and it was all like volunteer parent, because again, these places don't have money, so it's all about this volunteer organization, and she headed up a lot of that. And as she got more involved, I just sort of, it felt like this snowball effect, and that question is a common one, right? Like, when was the moment? And I kind of just remember like waking up and being like, this is something I really have to do. And so briefly, of course, as a man, and then also just as a person, we're always told that like being an artist is not a legitimate career. Like we're always just told, yeah, you won't be able to have a home, a family, anything, like, that's starving artist narrative, right? That's all baked into everything that we've been talking about. And it wasn't until I was applying to college that I really thought, I was like, wait, am I gonna like actually do this as a career, or do I just need to like take my sort of hard left right now and go and study something normal? And my mom said, I won't even help you with your college applications. I won't help you with anything unless you audition for at least one school. And I was like, okay, then I will. And I actually applied to Yale early. I got waitlisted. I did that weird thing where like, if you got in, you have to go. But if you, it's like early. Yes. So I was like, I'll just do that. And it wasn't for drama or anything. I was just like, I applied to undecided. I was like, I'll just do that. I think like that would be a place where I'm going to flourish. I went to like a prep school for high school that had a sort of great like avant-garde theater program, but it wasn't the type that was like, you had your book and you had your songs. I mean, I had no idea. And on the wait list, I was like, I guess I do have to do one of these auditions. And so I found the place that I thought I would flourish, and that was Michigan. And I went and auditioned and went and visited the campus, and I just like never looked back. I just immediately was just like, oh, this, like, what was I telling myself? All that self-doubt, like, what are you doing? And just sort of like hit the ground running after that.
Amazing. I did Impulse back in
nice.
So it's a place that I love and have many friends who went as well. And I was going to ask, how do you think that your experience there prepared you or didn't prepare you for the real world theater industry?
This is a conversation I've actually had very recently with my two closest friends from the school, and both are Black men. And they obviously had a completely different experience than I did. I mean, this is a large university and a musical theater program, which is synonymous with white supremacy. That is what all musical theater programs, until proven otherwise, are. All universities, frankly, I mean, many obviously exempting, HBCUs and different ones that have exceptions, but this was an environment that immediately embraced me, and that I embraced immediately. I loved the fact that it was a university and that had this program. There was an emphasis on being well-rounded and being an educated citizen and individual, and not just a performing robot. And I think the biggest thing, that the head of the department is no longer there, that who started the department, Brent Wagner, but of course, the legend. And he, I have a great story about Brent Wagner after this that I have to tell. But please. His biggest thing, he talks about it ad nauseum in his intro class, and it lasts like truly the entire first semester, is your reputation. Your reputation matters more than anything. And I think it's broader than just being a performer. He was so worried about social media for this reason. It was really climbing when he was sort of leaving his post there. And it was like, he said, you have to be super careful about the things you post. You have to be super careful. And he relates it as, the kids we were ready to hear, which is like, don't post like videos of you singing that are bad, or like, don't like, post like videos of you drunk at a party or whatever. It's like, but I think it broadly sort of, you know, I tie all of what's going on now back to that. Really what it is you have to be ready to stand by what you, and you have to say what you believe, and you have to be ready to stand by it. And if those things are popular or unpopular, it's whatever it is, but that's your reputation. You know, your reputation needs to just be one of consistency. And that is when people trust you. And it doesn't mean that everybody agrees with you. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to want to work with you. I know after this time, I'm going to continue to stick my neck out about these things. And I know there are people who are going to see the way that I have acted and say, I can't have that energy in the room. And it's like, okay, you know, if that's my reputation, I also know that there are people who are listening and saying, okay, then I see this as, you know, that your reputation is consistent. And so that to me is like the sort of like Michigan, they call it the Michigan difference, but that to me is really like the Michigan difference, is like this idea that your reputation, everywhere you carry yourself, how you carry yourself, how you represent yourself is important. And very briefly, the story about Brent Wagner. I was in Waitress. I was in the original company of Waitress on Broadway, and Erica Henningsen and I went out to, she was in my class at Michigan, and we went out to lunch with Brent Wagner on a trip that he had to New York once. It was after I was in, he was actually coming to see me in Hamilton in New York. And it was, this was after I had been in Waitress. And this man is a musical theater encyclopedia. The man in Cher in Drowsy Chaperone, if you know it, like that is Brent Wagner. His office is literally like scripts and scores, and not just like Gypsy. It's like Gypsy, the draft of Gypsy, this revival of Gypsy, the script changes of this. He loves Gypsy. Gypsy is literally the cornerstone of Michigan's like musical theater education. And we're sitting at lunch, and he goes, I was walking around and I saw this, you know, I saw this marquee and that marquee. I just love being in New York. But I will say, I was on 47th Street, and I walked by and I saw that Waitress is still open, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And he went on this tirade about how like he hated Waitress, like he just thought it was so bad. And Erica's like squeezing my knee, like underneath the thing, being like, does he like know, like, is he remembering that you were in that, or is he like, and we're like laughing, and it kind of subsides, and I'm like, Mr. Wagner, I was in that, like, you remember that, right? And he's just like, oh, I know. Like, it's like he completely remembered. He's like, oh no, that is I was not mincing words, like, because you were here, like, and that is just so him. Like, it was just awesome. Like, I'll never forget that, of feeling like, ooh, we're about to get him, and be like, I was in that, and have him be embarrassed. He was like, no, I'm telling you, like, as a member of that company. Just so awesome. He's so great.
That's incredible. My Brent Wagner story is, I went to Impulse, and then similarly to you in some ways, I ended up going to Princeton, and I applied early. And I got in. And so I wrote Professor Wagner, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to go to the callback auditions in Michigan, but I love Michigan. Thank you. And I included, it was right when the ART Porgy and Bess was, well, I don't know if it was announced that it was going to go to Broadway. Yes, it had. And I had seen it that summer at the ART. And I included, I was like, I thought it was like fun, like a PS. And I was like, PS, Sondheim wrote this article in the Times criticizing this revival of Porgy and Bess. And I was like, what do you think of this? Like, I sort of disagree. And then he, not even really expecting him to respond. And then we had like a month-long correspondence, like delving into Porgy and Bess for a student who was not going to his school. And I think about that a lot, because I mean, that was a person that was interested in like unpacking what a musical is with anyone who would ask, no matter if they were a student or what. And I just think that's cool. That's a true lover of the theater.
The thing about Michigan, I think that and just, it's not about Michigan specifically, but this thing that I just like love, that I can see in people, and that I really admired in Brent Wagner, and why I think I was so excited to attend school there, is like, there is no cynicism about what we do. And when we are in New York and we are in shows and on Broadway and these things, there is so much of it. There's just so much cynicism. It's so like, you get to a show like Wicked with that. I mean, I made my Broadway debut in that show. It's 15 years deep, and the people who are just like, hey, you're on for this, and it's like, and I'm like literally, and I'm like, and it's not even about the gratitude or whatever. That's a whole different thing. But I'm just looking like, is it really that, it's like, this doesn't matter, like, oh, who cares about this, like, and even in a show like Hamilton, and I'm like, do we really not care about the impact that this is having? Again, like, why did we get into this? And all of the business part of what we do just hardens us to feel that way, and like, that is something that is absent in that man's brain.
Yeah, I think earnestness is something that turns a lot of people off of musical theater, because they're like, oh, it's so cringe. Like, I mean, I'm sarcastic, but I guess I'm sort of an earnest person, and maybe that's what draws me to it at the end of the day. And I hope for most people too. You've now told stories about both Waitress and Wicked. And I'm curious, because you were immediately thrown into this show that, as you say, is 15 years deep. It's like running like a well-oiled machine. And then you were in the original company of a show. So I was going to ask about the difference between like coming into a show that's been going forever versus a new company.
Yeah, I feel like I've had this sort of like methodical journey in that particular way of like development. You get into a show where you're a replacement, you're alone rehearsing with the dance captain. I still have voice memos on my phone from Alicia, who was a dance captain at Wicked, who's telling me like, draw your hand up your body, flick, down, down, look, move, 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 and jump, like these things that, like, because I'm not a dancer. So like, and then they're like, and then Sterling's going to move in front of you here, and Heather's behind you before Lindsay comes here, but wait for the other Lindsay who's going to come over here. And then Lindsay Wood, the third Lindsay, is going to move. And it's just like, oi, oi, oi. And then you're watching the show and you're like, let me find these people. And I'm like, everyone looks like a character from like Lord of the Rings. And you're just like, this is not easy. But it's also just not anything you're prepared for. It's just such a bizarre thing. And then in Waitress, this is proof, right, to keep at it. Like, I auditioned for it at ART, and they were like, no, this guy's so wrong for this. And I don't know, it was just a passing audition. I was like, okay, cool. And then it's coming to Broadway, and with the rearranging of folks who were leaving the company and stuff, I got another appointment, and I was like, I don't know, didn't they say I was wrong for this? Whatever. And I went in, and because of the show having been developed out of town, things changed, the roles changed, different things. And now all of a sudden it's like, actually, we think his energy is maybe a little more right. And so, and then I'm also more experienced, all the things. So it's like, so I joined the company of Waitress for the lab that we did that was sort of like pre-Broadway. And without getting too much into that, the lab contracts are absurd. It basically strips all of your creative agency out of it. You're not paid for anything that you do, but you make like a nominal sum, and then they're able to just move into rehearsal for an actual living wage. But I did the lab of Waitress, and like that, the show was like, half baked, but it kind of was, it was further along, obviously, than probably what it was moving to ART, but there were still things that were totally changed. There were a million changes happening in the lab and throughout rehearsal and throughout tech and all of these things. And so that to me was almost like a little bit of training wheels for developing a new show, but we were still getting off the ground. And then, you kind of have the amalgamation of the two, of like going to something like Hamilton that was already done, that was already, it existed. But when we were rehearsing for the tour, like, we all started together. That group was its original group. And so there's enough sort of originality and stuff that they're able to talk about there that I think is sort of like the mending of the development and the robot Wicked experience. And it's all and that's not to say you don't have creative agency or expression in these things, but being spoon-fed material, making up the own material, and then like being spoon-fed material that you can embody originally with that group is kind of like the amalgam. And then when you get to something like Wrong Man, that, while I was doing Hamilton, that was a song cycle written by this guy Ross, who writes for like Ariana Grande and Pink and Maroon 5 and all these people. It's like, he is a pop writer. He had written this song cycle about a man who's wrongfully accused of murder, and he had been sort of peddling it as his oh, cool, you write pop music, but what do you work on when you're not working on your career? And he's like, oh, I have this thing. And so he would like play it, and people are like, oh, it's like, oh, that's cool. And that was kind of his like ringer. And so Josh Henry and I went in and sang some of this music, like very like workshop, like sitting at the music stands, like just saying some of this music for Ross. And it was that process that like made Ross more interested in making this into a show. And so that I felt like I was really ready to do, because now we were developing something from, the piece in a structural form kind of existed, but we were popping songs out, writing new songs all the time. But I mean, the staging, the creation of that show was a completely original, like, what do we do with this? Like, what are we going to do? And having agency in the room to say like, this would be a good idea, and having that shot down and just being like, okay, cool. It's like, but it was a truly collaborative process, because then as you all develop the language together, it's like that I felt like I was only ready for because of those like 3 experiences prior.
Is that what you like best, being able to be in the room for a new work?
Yeah, it's like, I literally like that more than even performing in the show. Like, I loved performing in Wrong Man. Like, it was an amazing experience. Like, that show is very special to me, but the development of it, the first couple weeks of like, before it was even, there was no theater, there was no nothing. When we were just doing this for each other, no theater owners were coming. Like, the presentation was like 5 people. It's like, that was to me like the highlight of my New York like professional life. I mean, those songs were like written with me. Like, it's like those things of being like, of doing something. It's like the little riffs, the runs, but also like full melodic things that I'm just like, hey, this isn't great in my voice. Like, I love this, but I just think this is going to be more successful if, and it was just like, yeah. And credit to Ross, who his ego is the pea-sized. He was just like, yeah, like, okay, let's change it. Like, whatever works. I want it to be good for us, for you. Yeah, those first like days where you're like opening up the binder and like Alex Lacamoire is at the piano and he's like playing, and you do something and he's like, woo. I have voice memos of him going like playing and I'm singing and he's like, woo, or something. And I'm like, clip that part and just keep it forever. Cause I'm just like, that is like, that's it for me,
Do you think of yourself as primarily a musical theater actor? I know you've done some TV and film as well, but are you interested in doing lots of plays as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, I love being on stage. Like, I love that live energy. The things that I've done on TV and film and stuff have been, it's just always struck me how like dead it feels. Like, they're like, okay, everybody, like, here we go, we're going to start. And that's the moment where in the theater, it's like, everybody goes quiet and you're like, the energy is so alive. And they're like, okay, like, we're going to start. And it's just like flat line, like, of everything. Yeah. And you're like, okay, like, here we go. And it's like deadly quiet. And it's like, there's people in your face, like, it just feels so unnatural to me. And which is just, I think, a matter of experience, because I've had so much more experience doing theater. But like, yeah, I mean, like, like you said, this earnestness, like, I love musicals. Like, I just love musicals. Like, I love the energy of like big production number of like, boom, 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 and it's like the audience, like, not even just being like, now we're clapping. It's like this visceral, like, like thing, like it's amazing, and it's communal, and there's nothing else like it. Seeing a movie in a theater is not the same. The actors don't know that you're seeing it. That energy, that conversation, like, I don't know. I don't know if I'll ever get over that.
No, it's the best. It's why we do what we do. Last question before we have to do our Thank You Five and wrap it up. I'm bringing it sort of back to the space where we were before. And I'm only asking you this because as we've discussed, I think of you as this very politically active actor. And this is a question that I've been thinking about a lot during the pandemic. And I think anyone who's thinking about the conversations we've been having should be, do you think that there needs to be federal support for the arts on a grand scale?
Yes.
Simple
yes.
answer.
I do. Yes, I do. And I think that we as artists should be mindful about how we return that support when we endorse candidates, when we organize, and if we organize. I mean, like, there was a reason that in, the sort of existential void of 2020, that artists were popping up with, even like, I can only speak from my experience, but with Swing From Home, this organization, I mean, I had artists cropping up from everywhere saying, I'll do anything. How can I help? How can I do this? That energy needs to be always. We do not think of ourselves as workers. We only think of ourselves as artists because we're lucky to do what we do. We need to think of ourselves as active citizens and as workers. And if we are able to harness this thing that we can over, centuries, like we've been telling stories live and this idea of live theater, I'm so confident that it will come back strongly because it has always been. It will always be there. And there's a reason for that. And if we can harness that and use that to move the ball forward and help in that effort, that is when, a president like Joe Biden, when he's talking about, I always make this joke, it's like if actors were coal miners in West Virginia, we would have been on CNN all of 2020 talking about how we weren't getting money or anything. It's like, let's be that. Activate, engage.
I want to wrap things up with the Thank You Five segment. These are designed to be fun, off the cuff. Obviously, if you don't want to answer, you don't have to. I've had people not want to answer. First, you sort of answered this already. Best theatrical experience you've had to date?
Yes, absolutely. The first time I ever sang the song called Take Off Your Clothes from The Wrong Man with Alex Lacamoire at the piano.
Amazing. And Lemon's making an appearance.
Yes. She'll get on stage eventually.
Can't wait. She'll be a star. She'll replace us all. Your dream role?
It does not exist yet because it will be written with me in mind.
Incredible. Great answer. Do you have a favorite? This is a weird one. Do you have a favorite political play or musical?
Not that I'm thinking in the spirit of rapid fireness, not that I'm thinking a play or a musical, but I loved The Watchmen on HBO so much.
Incredible.
I loved that show. I rewatched it. I loved it. Yeah.
Incredible. Something people wouldn't know about your time in either Waitress or Wicked?
That I thought I was going to be eating my weight in pie on stage every night in Waitress, but that by the end of the run, we would all take this bite at the end, like of the opening number, and we were spitting that out every time. There's just no way. You cannot eat like a bite of a Sara Lee pie. Like my blood sugar is not ready.
Did you ever watch 30 Rock?
Mm-hmm.
You know that episode where Jenna gets back from having done Mystic Pizza, the musical, over the summer, and she's gained all that weight, and she's like, well, I was eating 2 slices of pizza 8 shows a week.
And now Mystic Pizza is going to be a musical out of Gunkwit.
Oh, can't wait. And finally, one thing, I know there are many things, but one thing you think needs to change about the way we do theater now?
The audiences we need to be doing active outreach in every single show to diversify the audiences, because the issue is that the white male producers are marketing to the same people that they have dinner parties with, and it's so expensive because of that. And things like EduHam, this thing that Hamilton does, where they have students come and perform pieces that inspired them, about the era, about the show or whatever, and they were inspired. They wrote a piece. These kids get to watch each other and are inspired by each other, and then they see the show for free. Like, that needs to exist everywhere, because that is how we create all of the change that we're talking about. The reason is because leadership, company management, stage management, all these things, these are white institutions, because that's the exposure that theater has. And if you're able to expose more people, not everybody in the audience at an EduHam is going to be an actor, but the people who love theater and they decide that they love that because of that experience and because of continued exposure, but they're just business people, we'll get them in the management offices, get them in the ad agencies. That's how this works. That's how we diversify everywhere. So to me, it starts when you're a kid. And so any outreach to diversify the audiences.
I could talk about all these things forever, as I'm sure you could as well. Thank you so much for coming on and being so open and candid and articulate. I'm worried I didn't talk enough about, your actual theatrical experiences, but I feel like this conversation was necessary and fruitful and good nonetheless. And we got some fun stuff in too. So thank you for tuning in. We will be back next week with some more incredible guests, and in a couple weeks we'll have another special episode. So thank you so much for watching.